42 years rewiring old houses, and I can count on one hand the number of breaker panels I've personally watched catch fire. But I get calls every week from homeowners whose panel trips 2 or 3 times a month, and they've just learned to live with it, flip it back, go about the night, never think about it again. That gap right there, between the panel that never fails and the one that's been quietly failing for years, comes down to one habit. It costs about $9 and takes 10 minutes twice a year, and almost nobody does it. I'm Walt. I started as an apprentice at 19, working under my father, and I've been doing this full time ever since. In 4 decades, you see the same panel problems over and over in every kind of house, and you start to notice something inspectors don't have time for. An inspector walks through once, signs the paperwork, and moves on to the next job. Nobody comes back. So the panel that passed inspection 20 years ago has been sitting there ever since, quietly aging. And the only person who's going to catch a problem before it becomes a fire is whoever opens that panel again. 9 times out of 10, nobody does. They open the door, flip the switch, and that's the whole relationship. Which is the actual problem, and it's exactly why I still run this same check on my own panel every spring and every fall. Here's the order I want to take this in. First, the habit itself, the tool, and how to actually read what it tells you, because the reading is where people mess it up, even when they try. Then I want to show you what else that same 10 minutes tends to turn up, because a panel almost never has just one problem sitting in it. Some of what turns up is worse than a hot breaker, one kind especially, still legal to own, still sitting in a few million houses right now, and I'll get to exactly why that one matters most. Every breaker in that panel is holding onto a wire with nothing but a screw. That's the entire connection. A metal screw clamped down on a length of copper that has to hold its grip for decades without anyone ever checking it again. Over time, especially in a house that's been through 20 or 30 summers of heat and cold, that screw loosens. Barely, at first. Sometimes a quarter turn is all it takes, and that's plenty. A loose connection doesn't just sit there being loose. It creates resistance, and resistance turns electricity into heat, right at the one point where the wire meets the screw. Here's the part that actually matters. Heat is the first symptom. It shows up before anything else does. Long before a breaker starts tripping for no reason. Long before you'd smell a thing. That one connection is running hotter than the one sitting right next to it. You can't see it through the plastic cover. You can't hear it. It has no smell yet. It's just quietly baking, month after month, behind a door you never open. By the time you can smell hot plastic in your own panel, the small fix window is already closed. What you're looking at now is a service call, maybe a full panel replacement, which around here runs somewhere close to $1,300 once you add labor and the permit. In the one case I ever walked into personally, that smell was the last warning before the wall cavity behind it caught. I had a job a few winters back where the homeowner swore the panel had never given her a single problem in 15 years. Cold garage, concrete floor, the kind of quiet you only get in a house at 7 in the morning. I pulled the dead front anyway, out of habit more than suspicion. One breaker read 40 degrees hotter than the one sitting right next to it. No trip, no warning light, nothing you'd ever notice walking past it with a laundry basket. So that's the mechanism. Heat before smell, every time. If you're waiting to smell something, you've already skipped the one warning that was cheap to catch. That's where the $9 habit comes in. Twice a year I open the dead front on my own panel, which is the plastic or metal cover with the breaker switches poking through it, usually held on by 4 screws. And I check one specific thing, heat, at every connection using a basic infrared thermometer. Not a fancy one, the kind that runs about $9, that you point and pull a trigger and it reads the surface temperature of whatever the little red dot lands on. Here's how I actually do it, and how you can do it too. First, decide whether you're comfortable doing this live or not, and if there's any doubt in your mind at all, shut off the main breaker before you touch anything else. I'm not going to tell you to do something you're not sure about. Second, remove the dead front, 4 screws usually. Set it aside somewhere it won't get stepped on. Third, point the thermometer at every breaker, one at a time, ideally while the circuits are actually under load. Dryer running, air conditioner on. Whatever pulls the most current in your house, have it running while you check, and you'll hear it click when you pull the trigger, with the number landing on the little screen half a second later. That's the whole test. Fourth, look for the outlier. Say most of your breakers read somewhere around 80 degrees. If one of them reads 130, that's not a coincidence. That's your loose connection, sitting right there on the screen, waiting for you to notice it before it introduces itself the hard way. Fifth, if you find a hot one, that's the moment to call an electrician, not the moment to grab a screwdriver, and never tighten the live panel yourself unless you actually know what you're doing. But now you're calling with a specific problem instead of a vague feeling that something's off, and that alone usually turns an emergency call into a scheduled one. A few things trip people up even after they've watched this. Don't just check the breakers you assume matter. I've found hot connections on circuits nobody thinks about twice, an old outdoor outlet circuit that had been quietly cooking for years because nobody ever touched it. And if you find one hot breaker, don't stop looking. Check the rest of the panel anyway, because problems like this rarely show up alone. That's the whole habit. Dead front off, thermometer out, look for the one that doesn't match the others. Do that every spring and every fall, and you will likely never join the list of people whose panel started a fire while they slept. If that's the only thing you take from this video, it already paid for itself. I put the whole checklist, every fix like this one, into a single guide, and the link's below if you want the complete version instead of hunting through my other videos for it. But that same 10-minute check turns up more than just a hot breaker. Some of what it finds is a lot more dangerous than a loose screw, and one of them is sitting in a few million houses that nobody's ever going to warn. If your house was built or rewired somewhere between 1965 and 1973, there's a real chance some of that wiring is solid aluminum instead of copper. Builders switched for a few years because copper prices spiked, and on paper it worked fine, since the wire carried current just like copper did. The problem showed up at the connections. Aluminum expands and contracts with heat differently than copper does, and every time that circuit heats up and cools back down, the connection underneath it loosens a little more than it would with copper. The Consumer Product Safety Commission studied this directly, and the number is not subtle. Homes wired with the older aluminum, the kind installed before 1972, were found to be 55 times more likely to have a connection reach what the report called fire hazard conditions, compared to a home wired with copper. 55 times. Not 55% more likely, 55 times. If that's your house, the twice-a-year check I just walked you through matters even more, because those connections deteriorate faster than copper ones do. So I'd run it every season instead of twice a year until you know your panel's normal baseline. And if you find warm cover plates, flickering lights with no obvious cause, or a burning smell near an outlet, that's not a coincidence you wait out. That's a call you make that day. You can usually tell aluminum wiring apart from copper the moment the dead front comes off, since it's dull silver instead of that dark reddish orange, and feels stiffer under a finger than copper does. Nothing fancy, just look. While you're already in there with the panel open, there's one more thing worth checking, and it costs nothing but a look. Something called double tapping, which happens when two wires get crammed under one breaker screw that was only ever designed to hold one. Most of the time, nobody meant any harm by it. Somebody added a new circuit years ago, ran out of room in the panel, and used what looked like an empty spot on a breaker instead of paying for a bigger box. The problem is that screw terminal was never built to clamp two wires evenly. One of them ends up loose no matter how hard you tighten it, and a loose wire under a breaker does exactly what a loose wire anywhere else does. It heats up and it starts to arc. It's also against code. Most breakers are only listed for a single wire, unless the breaker is specifically stamped for two. And if yours isn't stamped that way, two wires under one screw is a violation, whether anybody ever gets caught or not. I see it constantly in houses where somebody added a circuit for a hot tub, a garage, a finished basement, and just made do with what was already there. If you spot two wires disappearing under one screw while you're doing your heat check, that's worth its own call to an electrician, separate from anything else you find. Now here's the one I actually want you to remember out of everything in this video. If you open your panel and see the words Federal Pacific, or a red stripe running across the front of the breakers, stop and look closer. Look for the words stab lock stamped right on the breaker face, sometimes hard to read under 30 years of dust. Federal Pacific Electric made that breaker line, and it went into millions of homes between the 1950s and the late 1980s. On paper, it's a breaker like any other. Flip it, it should trip under overload, protect the circuit, do its job. Independent testing over the years found that a lot of them simply don't. Depending on which study you look at, anywhere from about 1 in 4 to as many as half of the stab lock breakers tested failed to trip when they were supposed to. The pattern repeated batch after batch, tested again and again across thousands of units, in independent labs, by insurance investigators, by people who had absolutely no reason to lie about what they found. Every time. It's a defect built into the design itself. Not a bad batch that slipped through a factory once. What actually surprises people every time I explain this is that nobody ever recalled them, since the Federal Safety Commission investigated for years, and the case eventually closed without a formal recall ever being issued. Federal Pacific went out of business decades ago, so nobody's manufacturing new stab lock breakers today. And a panel like that wouldn't pass inspection if an electrician tried installing one now. But the ones already bolted into walls back in the 70s and 80s never had to come out. They're just still there, in a few million houses, waiting on a circuit that might not save anyone the day it actually matters. Right now, while you're watching this, if you find that name on your panel, that's not a twice-a-year situation. That's a call this week. So that's everything that 10-minute habit tends to turn up. A hot breaker you can catch before it's a fire, aluminum wiring that's aging faster than you'd think, a double tap somebody added and forgot about. And every so often, a panel that was never actually safe to begin with, sitting there quietly since before some of you were born. None of that shows up if the dead front never comes off. The guide I mentioned earlier has all of this laid out by house age, so you know exactly what you're likely dealing with before you ever call anyone. Links below. But here's what I actually think about walking out of these houses. The panel itself rarely surprises me anymore. What gets me is how long it sat there working fine, right up until the day it didn't. So the real question isn't whether your panel looks okay right now. It's whether you'd actually know if it stopped being okay 6 months ago.